During our school years, we were taught in detail about the start of World War II and the Great Patriotic War, and how Stalin and the Soviet Union ultimately managed to defeat Nazi Germany. We knew how many thousands of T-34 tanks were produced, what tactics and strategies Marshal Zhukov developed and applied, and, of course, we heard about the Holocaust and the millions of victims. In other words, the school curriculum in the USSR, and later in the post-Soviet countries, focused primarily on the Great Patriotic War as the decisive stage of World War II, as well as on the heroism of the Soviet people and military leaders. At the same time, history is taught somewhat differently in German schools. There, World War II does not occupy such a central place in the school curriculum as it does here. The emphasis is on World War I, its consequences, and the conditions that actually led to the Nazis coming to power. The reason lies in the fact that it was World War I that became the main catalyst for all subsequent events. The collapse of the German Empire, political instability, economic crisis, and, of course, the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, was one of the harshest peace agreements in history. Germany was officially declared the sole culprit of the war, which automatically entailed heavy reparations, restrictions on the size of the army, loss of territory, and humiliation of national dignity. The Entente countries and their allies had agreed on these terms in advance in Paris. After the Caribbean crisis and a period of temporary easing of international tensions, the Treaty of Versailles increasingly became the subject of controversy and re-evaluation among historians. Contemporary researchers are less inclined to see Germany as the sole culprit of World War I. It is noted that the blame was distributed much more widely, among a number of European powers, each of which sought to strengthen its influence and prevent its rivals from gaining strength. However, in 1919, the victors' logic was different. They sought to consolidate their superiority and protect themselves from the defeated country's possible revanchist policies. The treaty itself had three key aspects. First, it punished the aggressor, which was expressed in Germany's acknowledgement of its guilt for starting the war. Second, reparations, monetary and property compensation to the victorious countries. And finally, the third aspect was the conditions for preventing a new war, which provided for military restrictions, reduction of the army, a ban on heavy weapons, demilitarization of the Rhine zone, and the loss of colonies. In reality, all this turned out to be an extremely heavy burden for Germany. At first, it was ordered to pay 20 billion gold marks, approximately 7,000 tons of gold, but soon the amount rose to an astronomical 269 billion gold marks. For a country with a devastated economy, this was absolutely unbearable. The people perceived such conditions as oppressive and humiliating, and it is not surprising that radical parties rose in popularity on this basis. In addition to financial pressure, Germany's economic potential was destroyed. The country lost 90% of its merchant fleet, without which international trade was virtually paralyzed. It was deprived of vast territories: Alsace-Lorraine, part of East Prussia, the Saar coal basin, and its colonies. As a result, Germany lost about 80% of its iron ore reserves, a third of its coal, almost half of its blast furnaces, and more than 15% of its agricultural land. All this severely undermined industrial production and made the economy deeply dependent on external conditions. In this atmosphere, the Nazis used the Treaty of Versailles as a powerful propaganda tool. They constantly referred to 1919 as a moment of national humiliation, instilled the idea that the Germans had been stabbed in the back, and promised to lift the country out of its knees. Millions of impoverished and desperate Germans eagerly accepted such slogans, as they promised revenge and the restoration of justice. In fact, without the consequences of Versailles, the National Socialists' rise to power would have been much less likely. The school curriculum does indeed pay great attention not only to dry dates and military operations, but also to an in-depth analysis of National Socialist tactics, ideology, and propaganda methods. Students are shown how the Nazis skillfully manipulated the mass consciousness, how they used dehumanization techniques to justify their crimes, and how this directly led to the Holocaust and other tragedies of World War II. German schools emphasize not only facts, but also emotional understanding of events. Former students recall that when studying this period, They did not simply read paragraphs from textbooks, but analyzed authentic documents and testimonies from survivors. Reports from Nazi officials themselves made a particular impression. For example, the report of a concentration camp commander who proudly reported to his superiors that thanks to an improved ventilation system and new methods of chemical distribution, their camp was capable of processing up to 20,000 prisoners per day. Such documents make teenagers feel the cold cynicism of the Nazi extermination machine and think about how easily the concept of normality can be distorted. An important part of the education is school trips to memorial sites such as Auschwitz in Poland or the Natzweiler-Struthof concentration camp in France. The excursion to Auschwitz, for example, begins with a 20-minute documentary film about the liberation of the camp by Soviet troops, after which the students walk through the barracks, gas chambers, and crematoria. This experience has a strong emotional impact, shaping the teenagers' personal attitudes toward the tragedy. In addition to excursions, the teaching materials include sections analyzing feature films and documentaries. Students are encouraged to watch films such as Death Academy, The Bunker, and Schindler's List, and then discuss how accurately the director conveyed historical reality and whether the emphasis was distorted. In this way, students learn not only to perceive information, but also to analyze it critically, distinguishing between documentary evidence and artistic fiction. Thus, the German educational program seeks not only to impart knowledge to children, but also to develop their critical thinking skills. The German school curriculum does indeed strive to present history as objectively as possible, but historians note that certain topics are covered incompletely or not at all. For example, Robert Meyer, a historian from Braunschweig, compared German and Polish textbooks and concluded that Poland devotes almost 3 times more space to World War II than Germany. Polish textbooks analyze the course of the war in detail, starting from September 1, 1939, and view the campaign as a war on 2 fronts, against Germany and the Soviet Union. According to Polish authors, it was this circumstance that predetermined Poland's rapid defeat. In German textbooks, however, Soviet aggression against Poland and the secret articles of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact are often mentioned only sparingly or not at all. This leads to a distorted impression that all of Poland was occupied exclusively by the Wehrmacht, although in reality the western and eastern territories were divided between Germany and the USSR. Robert Mayer points out that this omission gives school children the false impression that Hitler alone was responsible for the destruction of Polish statehood in September 1939. Similar gaps exist in Russian textbooks. They rarely mention that in 1939 to 1940, the USSR was in fact an ally of Germany, participated in the partition of Poland, and conducted military operations against Finland, the so-called Winter War. At the same time, the role of the Soviet Union at the beginning of the war is often presented as an exclusively liberation mission, which creates a bias in the perception of history. Russian textbooks also say very little or nothing at all about the secret protocols to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which cemented the division of Eastern Europe. The way events are presented in Italy is no less revealing. In most Italian school textbooks, only a limited number of pages are devoted to World War II, and Italy's participation is described in general terms. Only a couple of textbooks mention that only about 80,000 Italian soldiers actually fought on the side of Nazi Germany, and the liberation of the country from fascism is attributed almost exclusively to the actions of the US and its allies. The impression is that it was the Americans who brought freedom to Italy and won the decisive victory in the war, while the role of the Italian people and the contribution of other allies remain in the shadows. If we compare the situation with Germany and Japan, it is clear that the Germans have gone much further in their attempts to critically reflect on their own past. In Japanese history textbooks, many facts related to Japan's participation in World War II are either ignored or distorted. For example, the colonization of Korea, China, and other Asian countries is often presented in a justifying manner, as help for weak states or an attempt to modernize the region. While in Europe, the emphasis is on acknowledging responsibility and studying the consequences of totalitarian regimes, in Japan there are still textbooks that effectively gloss over or justify imperial expansion and crimes such as the Nanking Massacre. In Germany, the approach is completely different. For modern Germans, who had no personal connection to the war, patriotism has become a socially complex issue. If a person excessively demonstrates love for their country, there is a risk that they will quickly be labeled as heirs of the Nazis. Therefore, many Germans are cautious about national symbols. However, this does not mean a lack of national identity. Rather, it has taken on a more restrained and self-critical character. This is why the World Cup and other major sporting events in Germany take on special significance. They are almost the only time when millions of people can wave the German flag, cheer for their team, and openly express their joy for their country without shame or condemnation. The main goal of the German curriculum is not to instill a sense of guilt in schoolchildren for the crimes of Hitler and Nazism, but to show how mistakes and conflicts gradually accumulated, leading first to World War I and then to World War II. Teachers emphasize that the path to disaster was paved not by a single mistake, but by a whole chain of decisions, compromises, connivance, and national ambitions. Therefore, the German education system emphasizes the analysis of causes, propaganda mechanisms, the dehumanization of opponents, the role of charismatic leaders, and the passivity of society. The result is a system in which schoolchildren are not made to feel guilty, but are taught to understand that history can repeat itself if society is indifferent to injustice and thoughtlessly succumbs to nationalist rhetoric. Therefore, friends, always think for yourselves and do not rush to blindly trust politicians, journalists, or any other speakers who assure you of their truth. Human history has shown time and again that it is precisely through propaganda and manipulation of public consciousness that entire nations have been drawn into wars, destroyed their own states, and allowed those in power to profit from the suffering of others. If someone tries to turn you against other people, countries, or nationalities, you should immediately be on your guard. Especially if they start telling you that you are special or better than others just because you were born in this territory, and that all the problems in your life supposedly come from guilty neighbors or minorities. Such rhetoric has always been a convenient tool for those who want to divide and rule, diverting society's attention from real problems, corruption, economic crisis, government inaction, to an enemy image. It is important to think critically here. Analyze who exactly is saying these words, what their purpose is, and what benefits they may gain if people believe their messages. Pay attention to the sources of information cited. Are there facts, documents, verifiable evidence, or is everything based solely on loud slogans and emotions? Any information that is not backed up by evidence should be questioned. Also, think about what this could ultimately lead to. After all, hatred, reinforced by propaganda, very quickly escalates into real conflicts, violence, and wars. This is how the most tragic pages of world history began, from Nazism in Germany to ethnic cleansing in various regions of the world. Therefore, the ability to ask questions, compare facts from different sources, and draw your own conclusions is your protection against manipulation. Do not allow anyone to use your emotions for their own selfish purposes. The true strength of society lies not in seeking enemies, but in maintaining unity, respect, and common sense, even when there is a lot of noise and aggressive rhetoric around.